Guest speaker today is Janine Waller. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your last name correctly.
Excuse me, Mitch. Please speak into the microphone.
We can hear you.
No, can you speak into the microphone? We can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Better, thank you.
Okay. Janine is the Chief of Interpretation, Education, and Outreach at the Women's Rights and Harriet Tubman National Historic Parks in Seneca Falls and here in Auburn, respectively. So without further ado, I'd like to formally introduce Janine. Janine, take it away. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to quickly ask a tech question. Am I going to be able to screen share or no?
Yeah, I can I can do that.
Okay, cool.
So,
Just have a couple of photos. I mean, I know I'm great to look at, but you know, it's nice if you can actually see the people that I'm talking about since we can't be there today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I know that you have had a couple of folks from parks to come and talk with you before. Where are some of the places that you've heard from?
Harriet Tubman.
Ranger Kim. Any others further afield?
Women's Rights Park in Seneca Falls.
Mm-hmm. So you've had folks from the park talk to you before?
oh, a while ago.
Yeah, it's been,
Okay.
been a long time.
Okay. How about folks who have actually been to the park in Seneca Falls, have been to Women's Rights National Historical Park?
Yep.
Chad, Paul, Eileen, cool. I love repeat offenders. Mike, I see you. Thank you. I'm very excited when folks have been here before. It helps keep me honest. So a little bit about myself. I am new to the park, sort of. I started my job here back in March of 2020. If you can remember, way back then, it was a little bit crazy here. I was on board for about 2 weeks before we had to shut the park down. So right now, the visitor center is open twice a day, but we have rangers 7 days a week giving presentations outside the historic properties, telling about the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. My first visit here was a little bit longer ago than that. My father lives in Geneva, New York, and teaches at Hobart and William Smith colleges. So I first came to women's rights when I was 8 years old, about 30 years ago. And I came as a youngster to one of the youth programs. And it was a really transformative moment for me. It's, you know, we talk about the campaign in the Park Service now to find your park. This is my park, and it has been for decades. I've built some incredible memories here. It was the first time in my life that I really understood how people's lives in the past were different than mine, and especially how my life, if I had grown up in that time, wouldn't have been able to follow the same course. I wouldn't have been able to wear the same clothes that I wore. I wouldn't have been able to do the same things, have the same dreams. And so as an 8-year-old kid, that really made a huge impression on me, probably more than any other park. So it was always my dream to come back here. And I joined the Park Service about 15 years ago. I started working at Isle Royale National Park, which is up in northern Lake Superior in Michigan. And then I spent about 13 and a half years in Yellowstone National Park. So I was out west for a long time and kept trying to get back here to women's rights. And in that time, Harriet Tubman National Historical Park became a national park and was joined administratively to women's rights, joining that abolition story and the suffrage and women's rights stories together administratively in the way that they have always been tied together. So it's been an amazing opportunity for me to be here. And so I love talking about it. I'll try not to talk your ears off, but I am super excited to share this story, and hopefully it's as transformative for other people as it was for me. If you haven't been to the park in a while, I have a couple of pictures here for you. One second. And you can take a look at it. We have the Fall Street Visitor Center. It's at 136 Fall Street in the main Seneca Falls. Second. So many windows. There we go. That's the nice one. Okay. Here we go. That's the Wesleyan Chapel. So if you come into the visitor center again on Tuesdays and Thursdays, this is basically what you'll see. We have Declaration Park, which is in the middle between the Wesleyan Chapel and the Fall Street Visitor Center, which is where the water wall is that you could see behind me, and the mural with the Declaration of Sentiments printed on it. So what is all of that? Well, we're located in Seneca Falls and Waterloo, New York. We have 4 historic properties in addition to the visitor center. We have the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton House, the McClintock House, and the Hunt House. Who are these people? Hopefully you guys have had an introduction to these, in school and in community events. I've been in the area for a long time. I'm sure that some of the names that I'm going to talk to you about are very familiar from Auburn. But the story really sort of starts with Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. At least our story does. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton is first married, she marries a young abolitionist, and they take their honeymoon in London to go to the World Anti-Slavery Convention. And this is where she meets Lucretia Mott. They're both ardent abolitionists, and they're working really hard to end slavery in the United States. And they're tied together with activists in England who are working on the international slave trade, ending the international slave trade. So they get together, and they are both prohibited from participating in the convention, even though Lucretia Mott has been sent as a delegate. And instead of talking about slavery at this convention, they spend the first day and a half of the conference discussing whether or not women should be allowed to participate in the discussion. Now, this doesn't just come out of the blue. Abolition, it has been chugging along. There's anti-slavery activists and abolitionists. And there's some pretty fundamental questions happening in our country at that time, questions about who we are and what it means to be an American, basically. What it means to be an American, what it means to have rights, who gets to participate, who gets to be a member of society. And so this is happening not just, in anti-slavery conventions, but it's happening in churches. Who gets to speak in church, who gets to be a part of church, what is the role that they have. It's happening especially among the Quakers, who are saying, how can we, consider ourselves free after our own revolution when we have other people who are enslaved? There's just a lot going on there in the consciousness of our country. And so part of this is women questioning their own roles and really talking about whether or not they get to participate fully in society. And so this is just one of the things that kind of sets off Lucretia Mott. It sets off Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they really they bond really closely because they've both been kicked out, and they're neither one of them is able to participate in this thing that they've been participating in back home. And so they really decide, you know what, we need to have our own convention. We need to set aside time to talk about women's rights. And then they kind of go their separate ways for 8 years, right? They converse, they write letters back and forth, but they don't really have an opportunity to meet, and they never actually do follow up on that idea until about 8 years later. Now, Lucretia Mott is a pretty unassuming looking woman. She doesn't really seem like she's all that aggressive. She was only 5 feet tall. She was kind of an anarchist, though. Like, she's this 5 foot aggressive, no, not aggressive, but ardent, strident woman who has been talking all over the country, advocating for abolition for decades, right? So she's kind of famous. She's very persuasive. At one point, the Free Soil Party nominates her to be vice president of the United States on their platform. So, she's a known figure, and her sister, Martha, lives in Auburn, New York. I assume that everybody here is familiar with Martha Coffin Wright. And if you weren't before you talked to Ranger Kim from Harriet Tubman, I'm sure you are now. So Lucretia Coffin Mott and Martha Coffin Wright are sisters, and they do what sisters do. They visit and they talk. They talk about their beliefs. They talk about their families and what they want out of life. And they have the tradition of activism in their family. Martha has children of her own, so she's not quite as interested in touring around as Lucretia is, but they both have incredible intellect and have both received really quality educations, which is something that Elizabeth Cady Stanton has also been lucky enough to receive in her time. So it is a little bit different than a lot of the women of the period in that they were systemically denied access to education, but privately, all of these women were able to get good educations, classical educations, and learn public writing, public speaking, things like that. So summer of 1848 rolls around, and it's not unlike this year. It's pretty hot. It's pretty uncomfortable. I hear that, because they were wearing such voluminous clothes that they didn't sweat through them, so they weren't as hot as the rest of us, but they definitely didn't have air conditioning. So let's skip ahead here. So what ends up happening is on July 9th of 1848, a tea party is called. Lucretia Mott has come to visit her sister in Auburn, and they decide to get together with some of the local Quakers to talk about church, abolition, family, the things that they're doing. Jane Hunt and her husband Richard live in Waterloo, New York. Richard Hunt is a major property holder. He has lots of money, and he is one of the founding folks of Waterloo. He owned much of the property after the that he purchased after the Revolutionary War, and he owns a mercantile and several businesses and a mill in town. So he has a variety of different properties, and he's a Quaker. He's a very strident Quaker. He builds this house without the columns originally, but he builds this house and then starts farming the land and building his business from there. So Jane is actually his second wife, and actually maybe his third wife. She's a little bit younger than him, and she comes to live in Waterloo when it's actually growing quite a bit. In the time that between when her husband purchases the land and when this takes place, this tea party takes place, the town has pretty much increased in size tenfold. So there's a lot more people in Waterloo and Seneca Falls. It's not quite the bustle of Boston that Jane is used to, though. So she has a lot in common with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Her husband's sister-in-law is Marianne McClintock. Marianne McClintock and her husband own a house rent a house from the Hunts in Waterloo as well. They're also members of the group of friends, the Quaker group that meets in Waterloo. And these are some, like I said before, kind of radical folks. They're starting to question all of these different social tenets, everything from what is marriage to what is freedom to what is church, and the other Quakers are a little scared of them. So they actually have a pretty tight church group together, a pretty tight group of friends. It's a slightly different organization. And the McClintocks and the Hunts work together, live close together. They invite Lucretia and her sister Martha over because they're very famous. Lucretia's on a speaking tour, and they're part of the same group. And about a year earlier, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had moved to Seneca Falls as well, so she's invited to this tea party. So they get together, they have their tea party, and they start talking. I think you guys are probably familiar with those kinds of events, right? Has anybody sat around lately and maybe in front of their screen or around a small table with friends sort of talking about life in the last year or so?
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like every conversation I have starts out with like, how's your pandemic? Oh, it's rough. How's your pandemic? Oh, you wearing a mask? I don't know. Are you wearing a mask? And eventually it comes around to, oh, so-and-so's in the hospital. Oh, so-and-so just had a baby. And these are the conversations that we all have. And it's the conversation they had as well. They were talking about what was going on with their families. Martha is getting ready to have a baby. She's about a month away from having a baby. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is home with 3 children under the age of 5. So she's a busy lady. And they're talking about what that means to them. And the way Elizabeth Cady Stanton tells it, this is the first time in a year since she's moved to Seneca Falls from Philadelphia from Boston. And she finally feels like she's got a minute to herself to talk about what's going on with adults. And she gets a little bit not agitated. She gets really emotional about it. She's used to being in Boston with servants and people to help around the house and people to take care of her kids. And her father has talked her into moving away from all of that activism where she was hanging out with Emerson and, all of these people who are really involved in social change to move to this, bustling, but still really agricultural community. Her husband hasn't moved there yet. And she has gotten no one to wash the dishes. I mean, this is really the first time in her life that she's had been fully responsible for a household on her own. And she's got 3 little kids. That's enough to make my hair stand on end. And she was going pretty nuts. And so she starts confiding in these friends. And this is the part where the story changes a little bit for me, because I definitely have seen that kind of story before. I've done it. We make sitcoms about it. We've all seen a group of moms sitting around talking about their lives. But what's extraordinary here is that they turn from saying, wow, I feel a whole lot better. Let's do that again next week, to saying, you know what? Our whole life needs to change. Our whole country needs to change. And we're going to change it. That's where it really goes from the parlor to the public. It goes from being a personal experience to being a movement. And so right then they decide that they are going to have a convention, because that's what the abolitionists have done, right? They have conventions. They get groups of communities together, like-minded people, to talk about how they're going to make strides, how they're going to be active and slavery. Well, this is the toolkit that they have. They don't have social media. They don't have email. They don't have Zoom. What they have is the newspaper. What they have is word of mouth and bulletin boards. And so that's what they do. They decide that in 10 days' time, they're going to have a convention in Seneca Falls, right there. It's certainly easier to plan things at home. And Richard Hunt has actually helped to build the Wesleyan Chapel. He is one of the primary individual donors of the Wesleyan Chapel. So they know when it's available and that it's available. And it's a place that has a history of hosting dialogue about these kinds of major social issues. So it's a really natural choice for them. So they decide that they are going to book the Wesleyan Chapel, and they put an ad in the newspaper. It's just a short little sentence. Let's see, or a short little thing. It's a convention to discuss the civil, social, and religious condition and rights of women. And I'm going to go ahead and show that one to you just so you can see it. And they're going to make sure that they put in Lucretia Mott's name, because she's the famous one. She's the one that people know. They're going to highlight her because she will draw a crowd, right? The other really interesting thing about this is that they advertise that they're going to be discussing about women's rights, and they're going to have the first day of the meeting be held exclusively for women, but they are going to have men and women who address the congregation, and they're inviting men and women. Well, back in 1848, that was called a promiscuous audience. So women did not speak in front of men and women, mixed audiences at all. That was something that even Elizabeth Cady Stanton, this legally educated, incredibly, ambitious woman, she goes to prepare this and to prepare what she's going to say. And she's paralyzed. She can't even speak because this is so unusual to be talking to a group of men and women, which is probably hard for us to imagine right now, but it made her a little bit anxious. So in just 10 days time, they're going to have this major event. They're going to invite people, they're going to talk, and they need to think who else is going to come and what are they going to say? So they get together in the McClintock parlor. So the McClintock house is in Seneca, or is in Waterloo. It's about not quite a mile away from the Hunt house. And this is where they begin to draft the beginning of the formal women's rights movement, the beginning of the convention. They start trying to decide what are they going to say. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Mary Ann McClintock, Mary Ann's daughter Elizabeth, they get together and they start drafting looking at different documents, trying to figure out what they're going to say and how they're going to start this. And they come upon a pretty familiar beginning. Now, there are some pretty famous beginnings out there, especially in American literature. We talked about Shakespeare in your 5 and 5, right? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? From A Tale of Two Cities. Once upon a time. That's about as famous a beginning as you get. And they pick another famous beginning for their Declaration of Sentiments, right? When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion. Does this sound familiar yet? It's not quite 77 years ago. But we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is the most significant beginning they can think of. This is the most relevant beginning that they can get because it is talking about those fundamental principles of what we are entitled to simply as Americans, simply by virtue of being citizens and by being Americans. Now, at this time, they are not considered citizens. Right? It has been made very clear through legal precedent that women do not have citizenship rights in 1848. That doesn't come until much later. Their rights are covered over what's called coverture, and any individual rights that a woman has are absorbed by their husband when she gets married or possessed by her father before then. They have no rights to their wages, even when they work. They have no rights to their own children, whether they are married or not. They have no rights to divorce. There's an entire list of things that they come up with, much like the Declaration of Independence, a list of grievances, the things that are weighing heavily on their heart, the things that they feel contradict what their role as participants in society should be. And that list of grievances is about 16. The most significant and the most contentious of these is the right to elective franchise. And I want to talk a little bit about that before my time is up. We use words like suffrage and franchise, and I'm not talking about Wendy's. There's a lot of things, that basically mean the right to vote, right? And the definition of who gets to vote at that time is pretty narrow. Right? It doesn't include women. It doesn't include people of color. It doesn't include Indigenous Americans. It definitely doesn't include enslaved people. So then that definition is pretty narrow. And because Elizabeth Cady Stanton has had a legal education, her father is a judge. She was allowed to clerk in her father's law office. She received that incredible education, even though he is the one who never wanted her, even though her father is the one who never wanted her to use it. She knows what the limits are under the law. And so she feels really strongly that the only way to fight that is to be able to make laws. Right? You can't change the law if you're not able to have a voice in the law. And she really wants to include the elective franchise in the list of grievances as things that women are entitled to. And the other 5 women who are at the Tea Party and the women who are helping, so Marianne McClintock, Lucretia Mott, Martha Coffin Wright, Jane Hunt, Elizabeth McClintock, they all think that this is too risky. It's too much. Right. And a lot of people at the time didn't feel like it was a good idea for women to be involved in politics, not because they didn't think women were smart enough, but because they thought politics was pretty nasty business and that women were morally too upright to be participating in it. So it's kind of an interesting opposition, but they are really not sure about it. And there's one person who convinces Elizabeth Cady Stanton and convinces the other participants that they really do need to include the elective franchise, that this is important. And he's actually right here behind me. Martha Coffin Wright and Elizabeth McClintock are going to become very good friends with Frederick Douglass. And so Elizabeth McClintock is going to personally invite Frederick Douglass to come down from Rochester to attend the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. As far as we know, he's the only person of color who attended. Maybe, maybe not, but he's definitely the only one who was invited to speak. And he feels very strongly that, and is very compellingly convincing them that elective franchise, that suffrage is the way forward. And so that is one of the major themes that is invited to, or that is included in the Declaration of Sentiments, and that is debated over the course of this weekend. So on the 19th and 20th, you have about 300 people show up to talk about women's rights. After only 10 days of planning, 300 people show up. So it lets you know that this is a movement whose time has come. And while these 5 women are the first ones to publicly declare that it is time to talk about women's rights in America, this is the first convention specifically devoted to women's rights in America. It's not the first conversation that's happening. It's not even the first meeting that's happening, but it's the first big public ember, right? That's going to ignite this movement that is going to last for another, well, what day is it? It's going to last for quite a while. It's going to be another 82 years before they actually achieve suffrage for some women, and even longer to get what we would call universal suffrage in the United States. So Frederick Douglass's support is absolutely crucial to that event. I'm going to give up a little photo of the chapel itself so you can kind of get a sense of what it looked like in there. There we go. Let's share that screen. There you go. So this is what the Wesleyan Chapel looks like now. We've got these pews in the middle. In the time of the convention, there would have actually been 2 rows of pews. And if you can see these holes in the side, this is where the galleries would have been, 2 galleries on either side. So 300 people, even with fire codes today, the capacity is only 340 people. So this would have been a pretty tight fit. There would have been a lectern up at the front, kind of like you see here, and a podium similar to that one. It would have been incredibly hot, standing room only. These are the original rafters and original roofing from the top. So there's some airflow in there. But there were enough people interested in this that they were able to talk and debate for 2 days. And at the end of that, 100 people signed the Declaration of Sentiments, the declaration that stated that women should have free access to education. They should have the right to keep the money from their own wages. They should, free as in unencumbered, not unpaid for, but open access to education, that they should have the right to get a divorce. They should have the right to visit and have custody of their children in that case, that they shouldn't be forced to stay in unsafe arrangements, that they should be allowed to inherit property. All of these things were part of the Declaration of Sentiments. And unfortunately, there's no copy of that exists today. I think it's something that all of the scholars would really be excited to see. But what we do have is copies of it that were printed first by Frederick Douglass in his abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, and then it was picked up and sent all over the country. A week later, there's the second Women's Rights Convention in America is held in Rochester, New York. And this idea of this Declaration of Sentiments is picked up. Sometimes it's ridiculed as ridiculous. Sometimes it's lauded as revolutionary, but everybody starts talking about it. And it starts moving us a little bit closer. So that beginning, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that we all have the same inalienable rights, it gets a revival, right? It gets a revival that lasts all the way up through the Civil War, right? There's groups of people all over the country. There's the anti-slavery societies start joining into the women's club movements. They start forming these women's groups all over the country. They start petitioning the government. They start running for office and introducing all kinds of legislation at the local and state level to try and gain these rights for women. At the same time, you also have the labor movement that's happening, and young unemployed women young single women who are coming from rural areas are now coming to those factories, especially the woolen mills and the cotton mills in this area. They're starting to talk about having different lives, right? That moment that I talked about when I was 8 years old, starting to envision a different life, one that doesn't follow a prescribed path. That's what was started here in the chapel. That's what was started here in Seneca Falls. The ability for people to think differently about their own lives. And that's the story that we preserve here.